signature series sponsor, Strongbridge. Jeff Powell, who's president and CEO of Strongbridge, is also on the committee, and his team does a great job supporting our events and are the signature series sponsor. You can see the other list of sponsors on your screen, hopefully. I'm not going to read them all off, but we do appreciate all the help our sponsors have been doing financially, as well as being involved in the committee. And for anyone who wants to be involved in the committee, please reach out to Ashley White of the Loudoun Chamber, who's our representative. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our guest speaker, Gary Campbell of Womble, Dickinson. Welcome, Gary. He has presented at other events, including our SC&H's GovCon summit that we do each October. And we're happy to have him talk about basically navigating the small business rules, talking about Runway Act that came out, and other ways to work to manage your small size standard, and how M&A activities and joint ventures. So Gary, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you. And thank you.
All right. Thank you, Pete. And thank you everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. It's nice to have the opportunity to talk to you all for an hour or so today about something other than the impact of COVID. Fortunately for a lot of us in the government contracting industry, it's business as usual, certainly with some exceptions. So with that in mind, we thought it was still worth putting forth our webinar today. And what Jeff and Pete had asked for was kind of an update on some of the small business regulations, and how small businesses can continue to compete and take advantage of some of the opportunities that are out there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Ashley, did that work? I don't see the screen.
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay.
Right now you've got the main slide, first slide up.
Okay. All right. I got a Zoom screen, so I wasn't sure. Okay. So here's our. Bear with me. I'm sorry. Let's go. There we go. So here's our agenda for today. As you said, we're going to talk about some recent regulatory updates. We're going to talk about the business opportunities that are available to small businesses, and to try and grow your business and maybe participate in some contract opportunities that would not otherwise be available to you. And there we're talking about joint ventures, contractor team arrangements, and then the SBA's All Small MentorProtege program. And of course, another way for you to grow and to pursue more opportunities is, perhaps a merger, acquisition, or an investment. And we'll talk briefly on that and what impact that would have on your business. And I'm not sure. We'll leave some time at the end. We'll definitely have some time for questions. So hopefully we'll address what you need, but then also be available for questions. Any of these topics, at least the business opportunities and the M&A, are, they each could be full day seminars. So we're certainly not going to be able to hit everything, but we will be available for questions. So the big regulatory update, and it feels like it's been around forever, just because it's been talked about forever, but it really only took effect January 6th of this year, was the Runway Extension Act. And what that did was change how average annual receipts are calculated to determine your small business status. This has no impact on employee-based standards. It's only for those size standards that are calculated through your annual revenues. And what it did is change the period of calculation. Previously, it was for your previous 3 fiscal years, and it changed it to your previous 5 fiscal years. So obviously, this provides a longer runway for companies to remain small, And not only does that give you the opportunities that come with being small, a longer period of time to be able to participate in set-aside contracts, but also gives you a longer time to prepare your strategy as to how you're going to transition out. Once you grow out of being a small business, you have that period where you're too big to be small and too small to really compete with the larger businesses. So how are you going to attack that market? Are you going to look to be acquired? Are you going to look to acquire yourself? So this gives you a longer period of time to plan that out. So it's really a good thing. Of course, every company is different. Every company's revenues, in a perfect world, your revenue is growing every year, but that's, as we know, that's not always the case. So the transition to a 5-year period may not be beneficial to everyone. With that in mind, when the final rule came out, the Small Business Administration had a transition period. So for the next 2 years, until January 6, 2022, small businesses can choose either the new 5-year period or stick with the old 3-year period. And that will allow, some large businesses with declining revenues, a faster transition back to small business status. They can just use the previous 3 years rather than having to go back the full 5 years. So while I think this is generally a good thing, certainly some questions remain with it, particularly, can you change? I mean, it would be rare, but I'm sure there will be some instances where a company might benefit from a 3-year period 1 year, and then the next year may benefit from the 5-year period. So that still remains to be seen. But overall, we think it's a good thing. At the end of the year 2019, and this would have been fresher if we could have had the webinar on time last month, the SBA cleaned up a lot of their regulations. So this is kind of this notice that came out at the end of December 30th, 2019, had a lot of updates that we just want to make sure that you are aware of. One, didn't really change anything, but it kind of gave us a hint as to what may be coming, and that is, there could be an increased enforcement of the limitation on subcontracting, and that's because they modified the SBA regs to say that the COs may request information to determine compliance with the limitation on subcontracting. Arguably, the COs always had that authority, and they were always, the enforcement of that limitation on subcontracting. But putting it expressly in the regulations, may be a signal that that's going to be an area of enforcement going forward. So, if you are in a position where you have a small business subcontract and you do use subcontractors extensively, and maybe you're pushing up against that 50% limitation, be careful with your paperwork, keep your paperwork, and make sure everything is documented well. Another update was the clarifying the treatment of independent contractors for the limitation on subcontractor calculation. And this was interesting in that there was a inconsistency in the regulations, in that when you had to calculate how many employees you had to determine whether you were small or not, you had to count independent contractors. And then when you got to the limitation of subcontracting to determine if the work was performed by you or by a subcontractor, you had to count the independent contractor as performed by a subcontractor. So SBA finally fixed that iniquity, and now the rules are consistent. That if you count someone as if you count someone as an employee, if you count an independent contractor as an employee to determine your number of employees, then that work will be counted toward work you performed on the limitation of subcontracting. The next update had to do with how work is calculated. And again, sticking with the limitation of subcontracting, if your subcontractor moves from small to not small or changes their status, and in the past you got credit for a similar situated entity, SSE there, you would get credit for that, and that would not count as a subcontractor when in determining subcontractor status changes. You can no longer count it as a similar situated entity, and they'll need to go into the bucket of subcontracting, subject to the cap. So if your contracts don't already provide for it, you're going to want to require annual updates, so if the status changes. Again, this is all be part of the documentation you want. From the first thing we talked about the potential for increased enforcement. The next update was prospective in nature, and what they modified the SBA regs to do is that in the future, if there's a small business set aside, agencies can then conduct socioeconomic set aside competitions for orders under those multiple award contracts. So the small business set aside, there's multiple awardees, and then when an agency goes to compete for the orders, if the SBA approves, they can make it an 8A set aside, a hub zone set aside, an SDVO set aside. This got a lot of pushback. The comments were probably 50-50 split on it, as you can imagine, and because it changes the ground rules for future order competitions. So a small business, spends a lot of time, puts a proposal together, invests in being part of this multiple award contract, which potentially is large, over a course of 5 years or so, and then with no guarantee as to what they'll be able to compete for, because those future competitions could be restricted. There was some thought that that uncertainty would decrease small business participation in these contracts. So the SBA made it prospective. It doesn't remove that uncertainty as to how much business you'll be able to compete for, but at least it gives you the heads up that that could be coming before you decide to pursue the IDIQ. Okay, we're going to transition now to business opportunities and what different ways that you can pursue perhaps contracts that you wouldn't otherwise be able to pursue given a small business in your qualifications. So we'll talk generally about joint ventures, and really my goal here over these next few slides is to help identify the different types of arrangements that contractors have, because I think a lot of times we use these terms interchangeably. So we'd like to make sure everyone understands what the different agreements are and which ones may be appropriate in the different circumstances. So in general, the SBA regs allow for joint ventures of 2 or more concerns. And now, if it's a small business set aside, that JV can still compete as a small business and be eligible for award if each concern of the JV is small under whatever the applicable size standard is. Now, one exception for that is for 8A contracts. If it's an 8A set aside and you have a JV, then the 8A needs to be less than half the size of the size standard. Again, as usual, it's an SBA exception to an exception. JV agreements are generally pretty easy. They don't need to be in a specific form, but you're going to want to have it in writing. We're not forming a legal entity, so it's not a whole lot of upfront cost to do it. There are plenty of templates, and we'll kind of get to that later, available. So you're not recreating the wheel here, and there's a low barrier to entry to moving forward with them. They need to be registered in SAM because the award will be to a different entity, rather than one of the entities in the JV. A limitation on JVs is the 3 and 2 rule. This says that JVs are limited to 3 contracts in 2 years. It's not a strict prohibition, because what you see in practice is after JVs hit that cap, they will then form a new JV. The same two entities, nothing prohibits them from forming a new JV and then pursuing another two contracts. Eventually, SBA may look at that and see affiliation, and which affiliations concept we'll get to in a little bit. There's a current SBA proposal to eliminate the contract cap. So instead of the 3 and 2 rule, it'd simply be the 2-year rule, that these JVs are in place for 2 years, regardless of the success you have in pursuing contracts. One important note is when we talk about currently, the 3 contracts in 2 years, a IDIQ contract is treated as a single contract. So you are allowed to have multiple orders under that contract. You see that a lot with IDIQ, such as Alliant, that will have a small business suite of contracts. You'll see JVs participate in those, and they're eligible to compete for multiple awards under those contracts. Okay, within a subset of joint ventures is the SBA's MentorProtege programs. These are a slightly different animal, and as I said, there's always an exception to the exception. So while this is called the all small MentorProtege program, it's really not all small. It's almost all small. The 8A MentorProtege program is still separate, even though there is a SBA proposed rule to combine the two programs. The all small MentorProtege program was modeled after the SBA's 8A MentorProtege program, so there isn't too much of a difference, and much of what we talk about will be applicable to both, but there are some minor differences, and the most important is, and which we'll get to, is once you're approved to have a MentorProtege agreement, then the MentorProtege can enter into a JV to pursue contracts, and that JV does not need to be approved by the SBA. However, if it's an 8A JV, then it needs to be approved, but we'll touch upon that again. MentorProtege programs really provide a very good opportunity for both the mentor and the protege. The JV can qualify as a small business for any contract or subcontract where the protege qualifies as small for that applicable size standard or for the socioeconomic program. So it gives the large business the opportunity, access to a market that it wouldn't otherwise have without worrying about the limitations of subcontracting or some affiliation rules. And it gives the small business a list of benefits that we'll touch on the next slide. Another exception to the all small program, and this is really specific, it's for VA procurements for SDVOSBs or VOSBs. They don't run through the SBA's all small program. The VA has a Center for Verification and Evaluation. You'll see CVE often if you're in that world, and MentorProteges need to be vetted through and certified by the CVE. So hey, we talked about some of the MentorProtege assistance that's available. A small business is going to get technical and management assistance. As it looks to grow as a business, it can get financial assistance in the form of equity investments or loans. The mentor ownership in the protege is limited to 40%. And I've seen this work both ways. Usually, when you see a mentor-protege program, you don't see the equity investment, but some small businesses need it, and this is a way to get money into the business without having to worry about affiliation. From an outside business investing money and perhaps being deemed to have some type of control. because when someone's putting money into your business, they want some guarantees as to control what will happen. So this is a way around it if your business does need, an injection of equity. This can be creative. We had a situation where, we had a very successful services disabled veteran-owned small business, and we had another successful service disabled veteran-owned small business that had grown and was no longer a small business, so had to get out of that market. They weren't really competitors. They operated in different markets, related but different markets. So they formed a MentorProtege, and while the large business had access to contracts and opportunities that the small business did not have yet, but it wasn't, getting 60% of the work in those contracts, wasn't enough of a stake for the large business. So they wanted an equity stake, to make it worth their time. But the small business was also having success and had a lot of its contracts on its own as well. So you can get creative. We created a, separate class of shares that were only funded with the profits from the, we're able to exclude the small business's current contracts that went into those dividends for that Class B type of shares. So that was something that made a lot of business sense for both, and the rules allowed for it. So another benefit is you can have subcontracts flowing both ways. The small business subcontracts a large business, large business can subcontract a small business. The small business is going to get a trade education at no cost, and then depending on your needs, perhaps the biggest opportunity is participation in large, more complex contracts through the JV. In order to qualify as a protege, you just need to qualify small for the applicable size standard. Of course, if it's a different socioeconomic classification, you would need to qualify for that as well. A small business can have up to 2 mentors in its lifetime. Generally, you just have 1 mentor at a time, but there are provisions to allow for a second one if there was a need. There's no, it's a self-certifying size status determination, but if your size status does change, while you would not be eligible for new contracts, it would not impact the awards already made, which is, as we'll talk about, is different than normal set-asides. For mentor requirements, it need to be a business in good standing. It has to be a for-profit business, not suspended or barred. SBA will look to make sure that you have a successful track record. Generally, you have 1 protege at a time, but again, there are allowances to have up to 3 at a time, as long as you can demonstrate that there's no adverse impact on any protege. Typically, they'll end up being in different NAICS standards. I think it would be a harder sell if they were competitors. The MentorProtege, as I said, this will be a written agreement. Now, again, this is separate from any kind of discussion from a JV, which we'll get to. This is the agreement. It's online. It's on the SBA website. It's going to set forth what the mentor is going to do for the protege, specifically what the assistance will be. Whether it's just technical and managerial, whether it includes financial assistance. Once that agreement is complete, it's submitted to the SBA, and it has to be approved. They generally move pretty quick through these. I can't speak for our current situation. I haven't seen one go through in the last 2 months, but before that, they were being approved within 2 to 3 weeks. And then once you have that approval, you're free to go after business through a JV. And any changes to the small business, to the mentor-protege agreement need to be approved by the SBA. The term is 3 years, but they are generally extended for a second 3 years. And again, this is for the mentor-protege agreement, which is separate from any kind of JV you enter into as mentor-proteges. So once you have your approval for the mentor-protege agreement, as I said, you're free to pursue business. You'll enter into a JV. There's a template agreement on the SBA website. I have the link there. It's again, fairly simple process. It's a non-populated JV, meaning the JV doesn't have any employees. It's not a legal entity. It could be. You could go that route, but there's little reason to go through the trouble of forming a legal entity. Instead, you can do this contractual JV. Profits through the JV are shared in proportion to work share, and the protege must perform at least 40% of the work. So that again, different than it does away with the limitation of subcontracting, where the large business would be subject to a 49% cap. Here, the larger business can perform up to 60% of the work. The protege has to be the managing venture of the JV. And as I said, they don't need to be submitted or approved by the SBA unless it's an 8A. Then it needs to be submitted and approved, which of course will add some more time to be ready to put proposals in. Okay, another term that gets thrown around often are contractor teaming arrangements, and I think this is sometimes used interchangeably with joint ventures, sometimes used interchangeably with teaming agreements. But in our world, contractor teaming arrangements have their own specific meaning, and they're specific to GSA schedule opportunities. It allows agencies to procure a total solution. So it combines the supplies of services from the different members of the CTA, and there's no limit as to how many members you could have. So if you're a small business that has some offerings on the GSA schedule, and there's an opportunity that requires more than you have on schedule, you can enter into a CTA with another company and be able to deliver the full package to the agency. Each company needs to have its own schedule. Obviously, if it's a GSA schedule, procurement, anything offered has to be on schedule. So it either has to be on yours or your teammates. Again, there's no prescribed form for the CTA. It has to be in writing. But the GSA actually does a good job of providing some information here. There's a link to the website, and it'll tell you what a CTA should have. So as we said, these are different than teaming agreements. It doesn't set up the usual prime-sub relationship. Each member has privy of contract with the government. So it's different. It's a different animal than we normally see. These don't need to be approved by the GSA. If you see an opportunity, you can enter into a CTA and then go after the opportunity. If you're going after a small business set-aside, all members of the CTA need to be eligible for the order. So you can't just take advantage of one teammate's status. We've seen these work. Some people, as I said, they can either be on the shelf or tailored for more complex contracts. So you could have a CTA, and that could be there. And you're pursuing any opportunity that comes by. Typically that's maybe if you resell some IT equipment and you also need to provide warranty services, and you're going to find someone who can provide the warranty and services. Yeah, it's a usual package you deliver. Sometimes a procurement may be a little more complex, and you'll need to rework the CTA for that specific procurement. Okay, we're going to move on now to, what happens when, we talked about transitioning, where you're at the point where your business, perhaps needs a financial investment. Perhaps you want to acquire someone. What's going to be the effect of a merger, an acquisition, or investment on your small business? And the most often scenario is that transaction is going to impact your small business status due to the affiliation rules. And what can trigger affiliation? It can be the investment. It could be ownership or control by a non-preference individual. So if you're a woman-owned small business, a 8A or SDVO, in addition to being small and having one of those preference individuals own the business, they need to control the business. They need to be working full-time on the business, have, the highest executive position in the business. So if any of that changes, that's going to affect your status. Obviously, if you get bought, even if you maintain your own entity, but if you're owned or controlled by a larger company, that'll affect your status. And then, what we see sometimes is even if there's no change in ownership or control, if there's economic or technical dependence upon other businesses, the SBA will find affiliation. And we'll talk exactly what affiliation means. But the key there is once there's affiliation, then you're going to add up, if it's a revenue-based standard, you're going to add up the revenue for all of the companies that are affiliated. And if it's an employee-based standard, you're going to add up all of the employees of the companies that could be affiliated. And an example where someone may not, it's not intuitive, is a private equity investment. So private equity company invests in the small business. It's deemed to have control over that business. And then all of that PE's portfolio companies are then going to be affiliates. So even though they're in other industries, even though they have nothing to do with this business, they're all going to be deemed affiliated, and may no longer be considered a small business. So after any type of transaction, the SBA will look to see if the small business is still owned and controlled by the preference individual. If it's not, it could result in loss of eligibility for set-aside contracts going forward. Your service-disabled veteran status is usually lost due to the change in control. Contracts set aside under the 8A program will be terminated, unless a waiver is granted. And there are regulations that set out when a waiver would be granted. And then your small business size recertification may be required under IDIQ and long-term contracts. So here is something that causes a lot of confusion in our world. And part of the confusion is that there were some competing cases in the SBA's Office of Hearing and Appeals. And so recently, I say recently, within the last 2 to 3 years, the SBA revised its regulations to make it clearer as to what happens when you're a small business, you have a small business set-aside contract, and then there's a change in your status. So your status is determined at the time of offer. So if you're small at the time you submit your offer, it doesn't matter if that award is made 18 months later, you're no longer small, you're considered small for that contract. And you can continue to perform that contract despite the change. The exception to that is where concern grows to be other than small, the procuring agency may exercise options and still count the award as an award to a small business. However, the following exceptions apply. So if you're small and you grow organically to be other than small, the agency can still exercise your options in your contract, and you still consider small, and you can complete the performance of that contract. You would not be eligible for new contracts, but you can complete the performance of that contract subject to the following exceptions. So within 30 days of an approved contract novation, you need to recertify. And if upon that recertification, the contractor is other than small, the agency can no longer count the options or orders issued pursuant to the contract from that point forward towards its small business goals. So the agency can still continue to exercise options, issue orders to that small business contract. However, they can no longer count them to their goals, which may affect their motivation to do so. So, whether you think you'll be able to continue to perform under your small business set aside if a transaction is going to change your status really depends upon your relationship with that customer. Do you have that contract because there are 10 different small businesses that can meet their goals, and you have it just because you won the competition, or are you really providing something that they can't get elsewhere, and they're going to continue to exercise those options even if they can't get credit for it? So number one, talked about recertification after a contract novation. Number two talks about even if there is novation required, in the case of a merger, sale, or acquisition, the same rule applies. You're going to have to make a recertification, and then if there's a change in your status, the agency can continue to issue orders, but they can't count them toward their small business goals. So they may lose some motivation to do so. So I keep throwing around the word affiliation. I assume we're all familiar with it, but just to step back a second, affiliation, the general rule is that affiliation exists when one business controls or has the power to control another, or when a third party controls or has the power to control both. This control can arise through ownership. Right? So I own a certain amount of stock, so I can control the business. It can arise through management. I'm in charge of the day-to-day management of the company, or other relationships or interactions. And we talked about in the past, I said a trigger could be economic or technical dependence upon another company. The control can be positive or negative. Positive control is easy. We understand that. Majority ownership of the business, having a major block of voting stock, having control of the board of directors, that's easy to identify when there's positive control. Negative control sometimes it isn't as obvious to us. It's where a minority shareholder has the ability to prevent a quorum or otherwise block an action by the board of directors or a shareholder. Again, the theme is there's always an exception to the exception. Someone can make an investment in your small business. They're going to want to protect that investment. There are a limited number of extraordinary actions that they can block without rising to the level of affiliation. Declaring bankruptcy, selling the business, that type of thing. But the day-to-day actions of the company, cannot be included in those. And the SBA regs and the Office of Hearing and Appeals case law does a pretty good job of setting those out. Other affiliation red flags, as I said, it's not just the ownership, it's not just the control. The SBA affiliation regs do a good job of identifying a number of potential affiliation situations. There's the ostensible subcontractor rule, where, I'm a small business, but every contract I get, I'm subbing out to this large business because I don't know how to do the work. I need this company. I need their technical expertise to perform the work. When that happens repeatedly to the same company, that company may be deemed the ostensible subcontractor. They're actually, it's their knowledge and expertise that's running the contract, so there could be affiliation there. The concept of spinning out a company out of an old company or starting a brand new company, so they don't have the history of revenue, that would be deemed affiliated. If you have a new business, they're going to look to see how it's connected to any spin out, to find affiliation there. An identity of interest among family members, siblings, husband, wife, the interests are going to deem to be the same, and they're going to be combined. And then if that combined interest is determined to control the company, then they would be affiliated. So if your brother, if you own 35% of the company, your brother owns 20%, but your brother also has another business, then your interest is going to be deemed to be the same identity as your brother's. Combined, you have 55% of control of your company, and you're going to be deemed affiliated with the larger business of your brother. Economic dependence, most revenue coming from relationship with another business. Analogous to the ostensible subcontractor rule, except even if you're not subcontracting, if all your work comes from a single contractor, there could be deemed affiliation. And I keep saying could be deemed, maybe, because there's no bright line rules. The SBA considers the totality of the circumstances, but any situation that you may have, chances are it's been seen before. And so while we don't have bright line rules, the SBA Office of Hearing and Appeal Cases provide some good guidance. At least they'll tell you what is affiliation. You don't find, and it'll tell you what is an affiliation as well. And chances are you may fall somewhere in the middle, but at least it sets parameters. But because it's totality of circumstances, there are really no guarantees. But as we've talked about, there are different ways to be creative. The important thing is you identify what your need is, determine what your business plan is, and then work with someone to see how you can achieve that through the SBA regulations. And that's the end of the presentation. So we're available for questions if there are any.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Gary. We do have a couple questions here. I'll just moderate these for you. So someone asked, can you expand on the rule that to form a JV with an 8A, the 8A must be less than half the size standard? For example, an 8A over 15 million in average revenue cannot form a JV with another small business to go after GSA Stars 3 with a size standard of 30 million. That's there in the chat if you want to read over that.
Okay, I think I understand the question. That is correct. So if the size standard for that contract's NAICS code is 30 million, and you have a JV between an 8A and a small business, that 8A's average annual revenue would need to be less than 15 million to pursue a STARS 8A set aside. They could pursue other small business orders under STARS, but for the 8A, they would need to be, that 8A company would need to be less than 15 million. Now that's a straight JV, not a MentorProtege. MentorProtege would not have that limitation. So I apologize if I didn't make that clear.
Gotcha. No, that's helpful. So you said that CTAs are only allowed under the GSA schedule. Jeff asks, the NIH CIO SB4 draft RFP has a provision to allow CTAs that appear to be the same as a GSA schedule CTA. How are they doing that?
They certainly can. I wasn't aware of that, but there's no regulation that would prohibit that at all. I guess I should say where we see, when we see the term CTA, it's a specific reference to what we talked about, the GSA schedule, but there wouldn't be anything that would prohibit another agency from allowing CTAs through the same manner.
Gotcha, thank you. Another question, has SAM been updated to reflect the size standard rule of 3 years to 5 years? Or do you know when it will be updated?
What's it? If what was updated? Oh,
Sam. Has Sam.
Oh, Sam, yeah. SAM. I don't know if it's been updated. I don't think it needs to be updated. I know one question would be when because you're self-representing, you're small there, correct? So, the regulations have been updated as to how you calculate your small business status. Whether there was a question as to whether you would identify within SAM as to whether you made your calculation based on 3 years or 5 years. I don't believe that's been done yet.
So they haven't added the extra question to delineate between whether you're using 3 or 5, and it's still an option, just to clarify, right? You don't have to use the 5, is that correct?
Right, correct. Until January 6, 2022, you can use either 3 or 5. Yeah,
so whichever benefits you the best is what you want to do, clearly.
Exactly, yep. Yep, and to my knowledge, you don't have to identify yet in SAM which one you've picked.
Can you use different timeline for different procurement? So can you say, I want to use, can you pick and choose for, and this is from one of the questions, can you use the 3-year for one and 5-year for another?
I mean, that's a great question. I raised whether you could pick 3-year, 1 year, and 5-year the next year. Although I wonder, there's certainly no prohibition right now, and we don't have any further guidance on it. So I would say yes. Although I guess
yes until they tell you otherwise.
Right. Although I wonder what the benefit would be. I mean, because your revenues for the previous 3 fiscal years or the previous 5 fiscal years won't change.
Yeah, I don't know why you'd use, I mean, if you're getting a different answer and you need to stay small for both, that seems an odd one.
You're small, either way, you'd have a smaller number and a bigger number.
Yeah. Another question, would a company need to request their own reps and certs to confirm whether a company is small for subcontracting purposes?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely want a representation, and because the regulations allow for you to rely on your subcontractor's representation.
Yeah.
So,
in the flow down clauses, you're saying add the reps and certs to your subs on this.
Yeah, as a, the method that you see most is, in the old days it was Orca and now it's SAM. I mean, you don't need to copy and paste, those same reps into your contract, which I know some of the bigger guys do. Once you register in Raytheon's portal, you're making all those same representations that you had to make in SAM. So it doesn't need to be those reps and certs, but you definitely want a representation in the subcontract that your subcontractor is certifying that it is small for that procurement. that way you can rely on it and when you do your own calculation.
Well, I know you mentioned that it could be a full day to talk about M&A and how that impacts government contractors, small standards. I mean, I know the pitfalls. I got picked up a client after they got acquired by a PE firm that was dipping their toes into the GovCon market. Well, their toes got smushed because they didn't have a good due diligence team that understood government contract, and they lost pretty much 80% of the contracts within 6 months because they all had to get the contracting officers all said, yep, you got to recertify your small. Well, they couldn't recertify their small. So for anyone thinking that it's, they can go buy a company, be very careful if you're trying to buy a company and want to stay small, if you're another GovCon. So we probably should have another session on how that works. I have a client right now is trying to figure out if they're a 49% owner in a JV that's an SDVOSB, and that JV buys another SDVOSB because of the JV interest of the 49% interest, could that potentially blow the status and things like that? And I'm like, yeah, just get a good GovCon attorney who understands this stuff. I'm an accountant. I can help you with numbers and whether it's going to make sense from a numbers position, but when it comes to navigating the rules of M&A for the GovCon world, that's where you come in, Gary.
Yeah. So Pete, we could talk all day about M&A, and it would be two days if we invite our friend Dean.
Oh yeah. We'll just have to. The good thing about webinars, we can mute him. We have 4 minutes left. I'm not seeing any other questions pop up. Will the slides be available, at least in PDF? And I know this was being recorded, so we will have this available on playback. So I didn't know if you needed to present, but if anyone needs to reach out to Gary directly, there's his contact information, gary.campbell@wbd-us.com, as well as his phone number. So I do recommend if anyone has questions, please reach out to him directly. I'm sure he'd appreciate it as well. And Gary, please tell Cameron and Dean I said hi and hope they're doing well, as well as everybody else who's on this webinar. Please be safe. And looks like great weather out there, so I'm hoping some people are going to be able to get outside today.
All right, thanks, Pete. Thanks for the opportunity, and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
Absolutely, hopefully. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.